Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. My real mother is a vampire. I found out on the deep web her true identity. I've never been one to buy into conspiracy theories or those creepy pasta stories you find online. My life has been pretty normal, boring even, but about a month ago, I fell into a rabbit hole that I wish I'd never discovered. And now, I'm questioning everything I thought I knew about my family, about my mother. It all started with a random night of insomnia. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind running circles around the same pointless thoughts. You know the ones. Did I leave the stove on? What would happen if I quit my job tomorrow? Does anyone actually like kale? So naturally, I picked up my phone and started browsing Reddit, hoping to bore myself to sleep. I stumbled onto a thread in our unresolved mysteries that mentioned something about the deep web and how you can find some crazy stuff if you dig deep enough. A few users claimed they'd seen things that made their skin crawl. At that moment, sleep seemed like the last thing on my mind. Curiosity had me by the throat. I had heard of the deep web before, but never really thought about exploring it. But something about that thread just clicked. Maybe it was the dullness of my everyday life, or maybe it was just that insatiable need to see what all the fuss was about. So, I did what any rational person wouldn't. I downloaded Tor. The next night, I dove in. I thought it'd be a quick visit. Maybe I'd poke around, see some strange forums, and call it a night. But the deeper I went, the more hooked I became. There were marketplaces selling things that made eBay look like a garage sale, and forums where people discussed the most bizarre theories, alien experiments, government mind control, and rituals to summon who knows what. But what really got my attention were the forums discussing hidden identities, people who claimed that they'd uncovered their true lineage, discovered secret lives of their relatives. I'll admit it, the whole thing seemed ridiculous, until it didn't. In one of those forums, I found a post titled, "She's Not Who You Think She Is, Finding My True Family on the Deep Web." The guy went on and on about how he'd always had a feeling something was off about his parents. He described this experience of finding old hidden documents and photos that led him to believe his mother wasn't his mother. At first, I rolled my eyes, thinking this was just another guy with too much time on his hands. But then I saw the comments. People were sharing similar experiences, unearthing old birth certificates, secret letters, and even video footage that didn't add up. As I kept scrolling, one comment caught my eye. It read, "If you really want to know the truth, there's a site you should visit. Just be careful. Once you go there, you can't unsee what you'll find." There was a link. Just a random string of letters and numbers, nothing that made any sense. And of course, I clicked on it. The site loaded slowly, like it was deliberately taking its time to decide whether to let me in. When it finally did, I was greeted with a plain black screen and a single line of text that read, "Enter your email, and we will send you the key to your past." I hesitated. My rational brain told me to close the browser and go back to watching cat videos on YouTube. But that same gnawing curiosity pushed me forward. I typed in my email and hit submit. I didn't think much of it after that. Honestly, I figured it was some elaborate prank, or maybe even a phishing scam. I mean, why would I, an average guy with a 9-to-5 and a Netflix addiction, have any deep, dark secrets to uncover? A few days went by. and I almost forgot about the whole thing. Then late one night, I received an email. The subject line read, "Your key awaits." I stared at the screen for a solid minute before opening it. Inside was a single link and a message that simply said, "Welcome to the truth." Against my better judgment, I clicked the link. The site that opened looked like something straight out of a hacker movie. Green text on a black background, cryptic symbols lining the sides. In the center, a message flashed. "Begin your search. Enter the name you seek." I didn't know what to type. Was this some kind of twisted game? I thought about closing the window, but my hands moved on their own, typing in my mother's name. I hit enter, and the screen flickered for a moment before a list of results appeared. At first, it seemed like a regular search engine result, but something about it felt off. The first link was titled, Classified, Mother's Name, Unveiling the Hidden. I clicked on it, and what I saw next made my blood run cold. It was a grainy black and white photograph of my mother, but not as I knew her. She looked younger, her hair was longer, and she was surrounded by a group of people who looked like they belonged in a cult. They were all dressed in black, standing in a circle around what looked like an ancient stone altar. And in the center of that altar was something I couldn't quite make out, but it looked like bones, human bones. Underneath the photo was a block of text that made my stomach twist into knots. It read, "Her true form will be revealed under the blood moon. The ritual must be completed to maintain the illusion." I slammed my laptop shut and sat there, trembling. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was some elaborate hoax, or maybe someone had found an old photo of someone who looked like my mother and posted it with a bunch of made-up nonsense. But deep down, something told me it was more than that. I didn't sleep that night. All I could think about was that photo, those people, that altar, and the cold, hollow look in my mother's eyes. I knew I had to find out more, even if part of me was terrified of what I might uncover. The next day, I decided to confront her. I needed to see her reaction, to know if there was even a sliver of truth to what I'd found. But when I walked into the kitchen and saw her standing there, making breakfast like she did every morning, something stopped me. I couldn't bring myself to say a word, because for the first time in my life, I was afraid of her. I was afraid of my own mother. The day after I found that photo, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was like a cold weight pressing on my chest, growing heavier with every passing hour. Every little sound made me jump. An unexpected creak in the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, even the rustle of leaves outside. They all felt like whispers from some unseen presence, reminding me that I'd stepped into something I wasn't meant to know. I didn't confront my mom that day, or the day after that. The fear I felt was too raw, too real. Instead, I tried to act normal, but it was impossible. I started noticing things about her, small things, but they added up. She would catch me staring at her, and her smile wouldn't quite reach her eyes. When she thought I wasn't looking, her face would fall into this expression I'd never seen before. Something between sadness and hunger. It was like she was wearing a mask, and I was just beginning to see the cracks. One night, a few days later, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone to distract myself, when I heard a noise coming from downstairs. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but then it grew louder, this rhythmic, almost metallic sound, like something was scraping against the floor. My heart dropped into my stomach. I sat up, straining to hear, and the noise stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My first instinct was to just stay put, to pretend I hadn't heard anything and hope it would go away. But something in me, maybe it was that cursed curiosity again, made me get out of bed. I crept out of my room. The hallway stretched out in front of me like some endless tunnel. Every step I took seemed to echo, even though I was trying to be as quiet as possible. As I got closer to the stairs, I could hear it again, the scraping sound followed by a low murmur, almost like someone was talking to themselves. I reached the top of the stairs and peered down into the darkness below. The sound was definitely coming from the kitchen. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the railing, trying to steady myself. I had this gut-wrenching feeling that whatever I was about to see would change everything. I descended the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood beneath my feet, feeling like a betrayal. When I reached the bottom, I pressed myself against the wall and inched toward the kitchen doorway. The murmur had grown clearer now, and I could just make out the words. Must keep it hidden. Not yet. Soon. It was my mother's voice, but it was different. Lower, almost guttural. My throat tightened. I forced myself to peek around the corner, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My mother was standing in front of the open refrigerator, but she wasn't looking inside. She was hunched over something on the floor. It was too dark to make out exactly what it was, but I could see the glint of metal, something sharp, reflecting in the dim light. She was dragging it slowly back and forth across the floor, making that scraping sound I'd heard. I watched in horrified silence as she suddenly stopped, her head tilting slightly, as if she'd heard something. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest, I was sure she'd hear it too. But she didn't turn around. Instead, she stood up straight, her movements unnaturally stiff, and walked to the sink. I could see her hands now, and they were stained. Dark smears covered her fingers, something thick and wet that dripped onto the floor as she moved. She washed her hands with a strange kind of precision, scrubbing until the water ran clear. Then, without a word, she turned off the faucet, closed the refrigerator, and walked out of the kitchen. I pressed myself back against the wall, holding my breath as she passed by. She didn't see me, or at least, I don't think she did. Once I was sure she was gone, I let out the breath I'd been holding and cautiously stepped into the kitchen. My feet stuck to the floor with every step, and I looked down to see the source of the sound. It was a trail of some dark liquid smeared across the tiles. I knew it wasn't spilled juice or something normal. It was thicker, darker. My hand shook as I flipped on the light, and the sight that greeted me was even worse than I'd imagined. The refrigerator door was still slightly ajar, and I saw that the shelves inside were mostly empty, except for a single large glass jar on the top shelf. The jar was filled with what looked like congealed blood, and floating inside were what looked like pieces of something. I didn't want to get closer, but I couldn't stop myself. I approached the refrigerator and hesitantly reached out to touch the jar. As my fingers brushed against the cold glass, I saw something else. Small black shapes at the bottom of the fridge, almost hidden in the shadows. My stomach churned as I realized what they were. Teeth, human teeth, scattered like breadcrumbs across the floor. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The world spun around me as I clutched the counter to steady myself. This wasn't just some sick joke or misunderstanding. Something was horribly, horribly wrong. I had to get out of there. I needed to get away from her, from whatever she was. But even as I turned to run, a part of me knew that it was too late. Whatever was happening, whatever she was, it was already too late to escape. I fled back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it, as if that would somehow keep her, or whatever was pretending to be her, out. I pressed my back against the door, sinking to the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, but I had no answers. All I knew was that my mother was not my mother. Not anymore. As I sat there, huddled in the dark, I remembered the sight, the email, the photo. The words echoed in my mind. Her true form will be revealed under the blood moon. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling, as I googled the date of the next blood moon. When the results popped up on the screen, my heart nearly stopped. The next blood moon was only 2 days away. I don't know what's going to happen when that night comes, but I'm terrified to find out. Part of me wants to run, to get as far away from here as possible, but another part of me knows that there's no escaping this. Whatever my mother, or the thing wearing her face, has planned, it's coming, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. The 2 days leading up to the blood moon felt like living in a waking nightmare. Every moment was filled with a suffocating dread that clung to me like a second skin. My mother continued her usual routine, but now everything she did seemed calculated, deliberate, as if she was playing a part in some twisted theater production, and I was the only one who knew the truth. I tried to avoid her as much as possible, locking myself in my room under the pretense of being sick. She didn't seem to mind. If anything, she was almost too understanding, her voice soft and soothing whenever she spoke to me through the door, asking if I needed anything. But there was something behind that softness, something that made my skin crawl. It was like she was savoring the anticipation, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night before the blood moon, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I kept replaying that image of her in the kitchen, the jar in the fridge, the teeth scattered on the floor. What was she planning? What was I supposed to do? Running seemed impossible. She would know. And where would I go? Who could I tell? There was no way anyone would believe me. As the hours ticked by, I found myself back on my laptop, drawn once again to that site on the deep web. Maybe there was something I'd missed, some clue about what was going to happen. I pulled up the page with the search results for my mother's name. The photo was still there, as chilling as ever. But now I noticed something I hadn't before. A small, barely visible link at the bottom of the page. It read, "The ritual instructions." My heart pounded as I clicked on it, the screen flickering before displaying a new page. This one was filled with dense, archaic text that looked like it had been scanned from some ancient book. I squinted at the words, trying to make sense of them. The text described a ritual, an ancient ceremony meant to unveil the true form of a creature hidden among humans. The words were strange, filled with references to blood, the moon, and sacrifices. It was like reading the script of a horror movie, but the more I read, the more I realized that this was no fiction. The ritual required 3 key components: a blood offering from the closest kin, a sacred object that tied the creature to its human form, and the presence of the blood moon. The final step, the unveiling, would occur when the creature's true nature was revealed in the light of the blood moon, breaking the illusion and unleashing their power. I felt sick to my stomach as I read the final lines. The ritual wasn't just about revealing the creature's true form. It was about binding them to their human kin, trapping them in a twisted bond that would feed their power for generations. The blood offering, the text said, was the most crucial part, for it ensured the creature's control over their kin, making them complicit in the ritual's completion. My mind raced. Was I the blood offering? Was that why she hadn't confronted me about my strange behavior? Why she was so patient, so calm? The thought of being a part of something so horrific made my skin crawl, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what was happening. That night, I made up my mind. I couldn't just sit and wait for whatever horror was coming. I had to find out more, to understand what my mother had become. And the only way to do that was to confront her, to force her to tell me the truth before the blood moon rose. The next morning, I was a bundle of nerves, but I knew what I had to do. I waited until she was alone in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared breakfast. The normalcy of the scene made my stomach churn, knowing what lay beneath the surface. I walked in, trying to steady my voice as I said, "Mom, we need to talk." She turned to me with that same warm smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe even fear. "Of course, sweetie. What's on your mind?" I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as I forced the words out. "I know something's wrong. I know you're not who you say you are." For a moment, there was silence. Her smile faltered, and the air between us grew thick with tension. Then slowly, she set down the knife she was holding and turned to face me fully. Her eyes darkened, that mask of motherly affection slipping just enough to reveal the cold, calculating creature beneath. "And what makes you say that?" Her voice was calm, too calm, as if she was daring me to continue. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering in my chest. "I found out about the ritual, the blood moon, the offering. I know you're planning something, and I want to know what it is." For a moment, I thought she might deny it, laugh it off as some wild fantasy I'd cooked up. But instead, she sighed. A long, weary sigh, as if she'd been carrying a burden for far too long. "You've always been too curious for your own good," she said softly, almost regretfully. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out, not like this. But I suppose the time for secrets is over." She took a step toward me, and I instinctively backed away, but she held up a hand, signaling for me to stay put. "You're right," she continued, her voice growing colder, more detached. "I'm not your mother, not in the way you think." My breath caught in my throat as she spoke, her words unraveling the last shreds of my denial. I was once human, yes, but that was a long, long time ago. The ritual, the one you discovered, it's how I've survived all these years. It's how I've kept this form, kept this life. I shook my head, disbelief warring with the terror that was clawing at my insides. "What are you?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. She smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent shivers down my spine. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you, but let's just say that I've been around for centuries, taking on new identities, new families, to sustain myself. And now, it's your turn to fulfill your part in the ritual." I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. Everything I'd ever known, every memory I had of her, it was all a lie. She'd been planning this from the start, grooming me for this moment. "I won't do it," I said, my voice shaking. "I won't be part of this." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You don't have a choice," she said, her voice icy. The ritual must be completed. If you resist, it will only make things harder for both of us. I wanted to run, to get as far away from her as possible, but I knew she wouldn't let me. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer, deeper. Her true form, the thing she really was, seemed to be lurking just beneath the surface, ready to break free. The blood moon was only hours away, and I had no idea how I was going to survive the night. All I knew was that I had to find a way to stop her, to break free from this nightmare before it was too late. The hours leading up to the blood moon were the longest of my life. My mind was a chaotic mess, swinging between fear and desperation. Every second that ticked by felt like a countdown to my doom. I couldn't stay in the house with her, not knowing what she planned to do. But where could I go? How could I escape something I didn't even understand? I grabbed my car keys and slipped out of the house. When she wasn't looking, I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes darting between the road and the sky, which was slowly darkening as night fell. The blood moon was rising, and I had no idea what to do. I ended up in a parking lot of some deserted strip mall, the neon signs flickering as if the electricity couldn't quite make up its mind. I parked the car and just sat there, staring out the windshield, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept thinking about what she'd said, about the ritual and my role in it. If I was the blood offering, then I had to find a way to stop it, to break whatever twisted bond she was trying to forge. But I didn't know how. The ancient text on that site had been vague, filled with cryptic references to rituals and sacrifices, but it hadn't offered any solutions. I felt like I was trapped in a horror movie, with no way out and no idea how to fight back. As I sat there, my phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out and saw a text message from a number I didn't recognize. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. You can't run. The ritual will happen, with or without you. Accept your fate. My blood ran cold. I glanced around the empty parking lot, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. But there was no one. The text was like a death sentence, sealing my fate. She knew where I was. There was no escaping her. I deleted the message, my hand shaking, and started the car again. There had to be something I could do, some way to fight back. I couldn't just let her win, let her use me in whatever horrifying ritual she had planned. I drove back to the house, my mind racing. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was now a deep, bruised purple. The blood moon would be rising soon, and I knew that whatever was going to happen, it would happen tonight. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was eerily quiet. The lights were off, and the windows were dark, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Every instinct told me to turn around, to drive away, and never look back. But I couldn't leave without trying to stop her. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling like lead, and walked up to the front door. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The house was pitch black, the only light coming from the sliver of the moon that was visible through the windows. I felt like I was walking into a trap, like the walls were closing in on me with every step I took. I made my way to the kitchen, where I'd last seen her, but it was empty. The whole house felt wrong, like it was soaked in an invisible darkness, something that seeped into your bones and made you want to scream. But I didn't scream. I just kept moving, forcing myself to take each step, even though everything in me wanted to turn and run. I reached the living room, and that's when I saw her. She was standing in the center of the room, her back to me, her head tilted slightly as if she was listening for something. The room was lit by the faint glow of the moon, and I could see her shadow stretching across the floor, long and twisted, like it belonged to something much larger than her. I swallowed hard and took a step closer. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move at first, but then slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were different, darker, deeper, almost hollow. There was no warmth in them, no recognition, just a cold, predatory hunger that sent chills down my spine. "It's time," she said, her voice a low, guttural growl that didn't sound human. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "I won't let you do this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I won't be part of your ritual." She smiled, a twisted, unnatural smile that stretched too wide, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. "You don't have a choice," she said, her voice echoing in the empty room. "The ritual must be completed. The blood moon demands it." I felt like I was drowning in fear, my mind spinning as I tried to think of a way out. But she was right. I didn't have a choice. She was stronger than me, faster, more powerful. I was just a pawn in her twisted game, and there was nothing I could do to stop her. But then I remembered something from the text I'd read on the deep web. It had mentioned a way to break the ritual, to sever the bond between the creature and its kin. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance I had. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. "What if I'm not the one you need?" I said, my voice shaking. "What if you've got it wrong?" She narrowed her eyes, studying me with that cold, calculating gaze. "You are the blood offering," she said, her voice firm. "You are my kin, and you will complete the ritual." I shook my head, trying to sound convincing. "No," I said, taking a step forward. "You're wrong. I'm not your real kin. The ritual won't work if you use me." She hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. It was a small opening, but it was all I needed. I had to keep her talking, keep her distracted long enough to figure out what to do next. "If you go through with this, the ritual will fail," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "You'll lose your chance, and you'll be exposed. The blood moon will reveal your true form, and there will be no going back." For a moment, she seemed to waver, her eyes narrowing as she considered my words. But then, just as quickly, the doubt vanished, and her expression hardened. "You can't trick me," she said, her voice icy. "I know who you are, and I know what must be done." She stepped toward me, her eyes glowing with a strange, unnatural light. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and twist, closing in around us as she raised her hand, her fingers curling into claws. I was out of time. There was no way to stop her, no way to escape. I braced myself for the worst, my heart pounding in my chest as she moved closer, her eyes locked on mine. But just as she reached out to grab me, something strange happened. The room was suddenly filled with a blinding light, so bright that it forced me to close my eyes. I heard her scream, a blood-curdling, inhuman scream that made my blood run cold. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The room was empty, the shadows gone, the darkness lifted. The only sign that she had ever been there was a faint, acrid smell in the air, like burnt hair. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The blood moon was still visible through the window, its red glow casting an eerie light over the room. But she was gone. The ritual had been broken, the bond severed. I didn't know how it had happened or why, but I knew one thing for sure. I had survived. The nightmare was over, and I was free. Or so I thought. I didn't sleep that night. Even after she disappeared, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that the darkness hadn't fully lifted. I kept expecting her to come back, to step out of the shadows and finish what she'd started, but the house remained silent, almost too silent, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. The first light of dawn broke through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I felt a fleeting sense of relief. Maybe it was truly over. Maybe she was really gone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing about this was simple. I stayed in the house all day, too afraid to leave, too afraid to stay. I didn't know what to do, where to go. It was as if the world outside no longer existed. Everything felt hollow, empty. I kept replaying the events of the night in my mind, trying to piece together what had happened, how I had survived. But there were no answers, only more questions. By evening, the unease that had settled in my chest had grown into a full-blown panic. The blood moon was gone, but the memories of what I'd seen, what I'd felt, lingered like a stain on my mind. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent my heart racing. I needed to get out, to find some semblance of normalcy, something to prove that I hadn't lost my grip on reality. I grabbed my keys and left, not knowing where I was going, just driving aimlessly through the streets, trying to outrun the fear that had taken root inside me. The city was quiet, the streets mostly empty, and I found myself driving toward the outskirts of town, to the old cemetery where my grandparents were buried. I don't know why I went there. Maybe it was the need to feel connected to something familiar, something grounding. Or maybe it was the thought that if my mother truly was gone, I needed to be close to my real family, the people who had always been there, even if only in memory. I parked the car outside the cemetery gates and walked in, the gravel crunching under my feet, the air cold and still. The sun had set, and the cemetery was shrouded in shadows, the gravestones looming like silent sentinels in the dark. I found their graves easily, 2 simple headstones side by side, with their names carved into the weathered stone. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the names, trying to find some comfort in the familiarity of the place. But the unease wouldn't leave me. It gnawed at me, growing stronger with every passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the cemetery, partially hidden in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. It was her. My blood ran cold. She was back, but something was different this time. The darkness that had surrounded her before was gone, and in its place was an aura of something even more terrifying. Certainty. She wasn't here to frighten me, to chase me. She was here to finish what she'd started. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot, as she slowly started walking toward me. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was savoring the moment, drawing out my fear. I stumbled back, tripping over a gravestone, and fell to the ground. My hands scrambled for something to hold on to. but the earth beneath me felt like it was shifting, pulling me down. I looked up at her, terror clawing at my throat as she stopped just a few feet away, her eyes locking onto mine. "You thought you could escape," she said, her voice low and cold. "But you can't. The ritual was never meant to be stopped. It was meant to change." I didn't understand what she was saying. None of it made sense. The ritual had failed. She had disappeared. But as I lay there, staring up at her, a horrifying realization began to take shape. The light that had filled the room when she disappeared, the one that I thought had saved me, hadn't been a sign of victory. It had been the completion of the ritual, but not in the way I'd expected. The blood moon hadn't revealed her true form. It had revealed something else, something I hadn't seen, hadn't understood. The ritual hadn't failed. It had succeeded. "You are the offering," she continued, her voice almost a whisper now, "but not in the way you think. The bond has been forged, not broken, and now it's your turn." I shook my head, refusing to believe it, refusing to accept what she was saying. But deep down, I knew she was right. I could feel it, the darkness inside me, growing, spreading. It had been there all along, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the blood moon to bring it to the surface. She knelt down beside me, her hand reaching out to touch my face. Her fingers were cold like ice, and as they brushed against my skin, I felt something shift inside me, something dark and powerful, something that had been waiting for this very moment. "You're mine now," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine, her smile widening. "And soon you'll understand." I wanted to scream, to fight back, to run, but it was too late. The darkness was inside me, and it was consuming me, pulling me down into a place where there was no light, no escape. I could feel myself slipping away, the world around me fading as the last remnants of my humanity were stripped away. And as the last sliver of moonlight disappeared behind the clouds, I finally understood. She wasn't my mother. She never had been. I was hers. I joined a black chat on the deep web. Someone predicted my future. It all started because I was bored. I know that's probably the worst excuse for doing something stupid, but it's the truth. I'm just an average guy. Work, hang out with friends, play video games. But a few months ago, I found myself in a rut. The same old routine was starting to wear on me, and I was desperate for something new, something different. I'd always been fascinated by the weird corners of the internet. You know, the kind of stuff that you hear about in YouTube videos or read about in creepy Reddit threads. Things like ARGs, hidden websites, or even the deep web. The idea that there was this hidden layer of the internet where anything could happen intrigued me. I'd never been there though. I always figured it was more trouble than it was worth. But that day, curiosity got the best of me. I'm not exactly tech savvy, but I knew enough to find my way onto the deep web. It wasn't as difficult as I'd imagined. A quick search gave me all the information I needed. How to download Tor, what to avoid, and some common sense tips to keep myself safe. I convinced myself it was just a harmless exploration. I'd look around, see what all the fuss was about, and then get back to my normal life. No big deal, right? Well, after setting everything up, I spent the first hour or so aimlessly browsing random sites. Most of it was pretty underwhelming. Dodgy-looking marketplaces, forums with terrible UI, and a bunch of other stuff that was more annoying than scary. I was about to log off when I stumbled across something that caught my eye. A chat room. But it wasn't just any chat room. This one was titled Black Chat. I don't know why, but that name alone gave me chills. It was like it was daring me to click on it. There was nothing particularly special about the description. It just said something vague about discussing dark topics, but the word black felt ominous, almost like it was a warning. Of course, being the idiot that I am, I ignored every red flag and joined. The interface was simple, like something out of the early 2000s. There were only a few people online, no usernames, just anonymous numbers like user 123 and guest 456. The chat was slow, with only a few lines of text appearing every minute. Most of it was pretty standard creepy stuff. Talk about urban legends, conspiracy theories, and that kind of thing. Nothing too intense. I was about to leave when a new message popped up. User 789. Who here is ready to see the truth? Something about that line felt off. I waited to see if anyone would respond, but the chat stayed silent for a long time. Then just as I was about to close the window, another message appeared. User 789. If you really want to know, type yes. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was probably some stupid prank, I told myself, but part of me was intrigued. What was this truth they were talking about? I figured there was no harm in playing along. Worst case scenario, I'd just see some fake creepy story, laugh it off, and log out. So I typed yes. For a few seconds, nothing happened. I was starting to think I'd been ghosted when my screen flickered. The chat room vanished, replaced by a black screen with a single line of white text. You have been chosen. Chosen? For what? My heart started racing as I stared at the screen. I was about to close the browser when a new message appeared. We know who you are. We know what you've done. Let us show you what comes next. I didn't know how to react. This was supposed to be just a curiosity-driven dive into the deep web, nothing more. But now, it felt like I'd crossed some invisible line. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this was just some stupid chat room, someone messing around, trying to freak people out. There was no way they actually knew anything about me. But then, more text appeared. You live in a small town, don't you? Quiet, uneventful, almost boring. I felt a chill run down my spine. That could describe a lot of places, I told myself. It didn't mean anything, but the next line hit harder. You spend your Friday nights alone mostly, watching movies, browsing the internet, trying to escape the monotony of your life. My heart pounded in my chest. This was too specific. I hadn't mentioned anything about myself in the chat. How could they know? But it's not your past we're interested in. It's your future. Would you like to know what happens next? My hands were shaking. I should have closed the window. I should have turned off my computer and walked away. But I couldn't. I was hooked, like a moth to a flame. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me did want to know. Part of me was desperate to see what they were going to say. I typed, "What do you mean?" This time, the response was instant. Tonight, you will hear something in your house, a knock at your door. You will think it's the wind, but it's not. Do not answer it, no matter what you hear. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry. This had to be a joke, but it didn't feel like one. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to shut down my computer, but I was frozen in place. The chat went silent after that. No more messages, no sign-off, nothing. Just a blinking cursor, waiting for me to type something, anything. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the screen. feeling a growing sense of dread. Finally, I forced myself to log out. I closed the browser, shut down my computer, and sat in the dark, trying to shake off the weird feeling in my gut. It was just a prank, I told myself. There's no way anyone could know that much about me. But as I sat there in the quiet of my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that I'd invited something into my life that I wasn't prepared for. And then, just as I was about to turn on the TV to drown out the silence, I heard it. A knock at my door. I froze. The knock was faint, almost hesitant, but it echoed through my small apartment like a gunshot. My eyes darted to the door, half expecting to see it shaking on its hinges, but everything was still. The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just sat there, staring at the door, trying to convince myself that I hadn't actually heard anything. Maybe it was just the building settling, or a neighbor messing around, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. My mind raced back to the chat, to the message that had warned me. You will hear something in your house, a knock at your door. Do not answer it, no matter what you hear. The timing was too perfect, but that's all it was, right? A coincidence? Some random guy on the internet had gotten lucky with his creepy prediction. There was no way it was real. There was no way anyone could know what was happening in my life, let alone predict it. Another knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My stomach twisted into a knot, and I had to force myself to breathe. I stared at the door, every fiber of my being telling me not to get up. But I couldn't just sit there, could I? What if it was someone in trouble? What if it was an emergency? I knew the logical thing to do was to check. Just a quick look through the peephole, see who it was, and then decide what to do. But as I slowly stood up, my knees felt weak, like they might give out under me. My apartment suddenly felt too small, too quiet. The walls seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I took a deep breath and made my way to the door. Each step felt like a mile. The air was thick, heavy, as if it was pressing down on me, urging me to stop. But I couldn't. I had to know. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. What if I was making a mistake? What if I opened the door and found something or someone waiting for me? I swallowed hard and leaned forward, pressing my eye against the peephole. At first, all I could see was darkness. I squinted, trying to make out any shapes or figures in the dim hallway outside. My breath fogged up the tiny glass, and I wiped it away with my sleeve, trying to get a better view. That's when I saw it. Or rather, I didn't see it. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. I stared for a long time, waiting for something, anything to move. But nothing did. No shadows, no flickers of light. Just the same dull, lifeless corridor I'd walked through 1,000 times before. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. I definitely heard knocking. Twice. But now there was no one there. Was I imagining things? Was this just my mind playing tricks on me after that bizarre chat? I leaned away from the door, my pulse still racing. I had to be losing it. Maybe all those hours of scrolling through creepy stories had finally gotten to me. But just as I turned away, another sound stopped me cold. It wasn't a knock this time. It was a whisper. I whipped back around, pressing my ear to the door, straining to hear. At first, it was too quiet to make out, just a low murmur, like someone speaking under their breath. But then it got louder, clearer. My name. Someone was whispering my name, not just whispering it, chanting it, over and over again, like a mantra. The sound was so faint, I wasn't sure if I was actually hearing it, or if my brain was filling in the gaps. But it was there, and it was coming from the other side of the door. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. This wasn't just a prank. This wasn't some random creep trying to mess with me. Whoever or whatever was out there knew who I was. They knew my name, and they were right outside my door. I felt panic rise in my throat. Every instinct I had was telling me to get out of there, to run. But where could I go? I was on the 3rd floor with no fire escape. And besides, what if this thing, this person, wasn't outside anymore? What if it was already inside? My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that looked out of place. Shadows danced across the walls, shifting as the wind outside picked up. But nothing seemed different. Everything was just as I had left it. Then the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The air was still, the room dead quiet. It was like the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. Finally, I forced myself to back away from the door. Whatever was happening, I couldn't just stand there like a sitting duck. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what to do next. But as I turned to grab my phone, something caught my eye. The corner of my bedroom, the one I usually kept cluttered with clothes and boxes, was empty. The clutter was gone, and in its place was a small black envelope. I hadn't noticed it before, and I was sure it hadn't been there when I had last checked the room. I stared at it, my mouth dry. There was no way someone could have slipped it under the door without me hearing. But then how did it get there? I approached the envelope cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. The black paper felt cold, almost wet, like it had been left out in the rain. My name was scrawled on the front in shaky, uneven handwriting that didn't look like it belonged to a person who was entirely sane. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to throw it away, to get as far from it as possible, but I couldn't help myself. My hands moved on their own, carefully peeling back the flap and sliding out a small folded piece of paper. The message inside was short, written in the same erratic handwriting. "This is your only warning. Leave now, or face the consequences." My hands shook as I read and reread the note. Leave now? Leave where? My apartment? My town? And who was giving me this warning? Was it the same person or thing that had knocked on my door? The one that had whispered my name? Before I could think too much about it, the light bulb in my living room flickered and then went out. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I was done. Whatever game this was, I didn't want to play anymore. I grabbed my phone and my keys, not even bothering to pack a bag, and bolted out of my apartment. But as I ran down the stairs, the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't coming from outside my door. It was inside my head, circling around like a storm, getting louder and louder until it was all I could hear. "You can't escape." I burst out of my apartment building, my heart racing, my mind a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. The night air was cold and biting, but it did nothing to clear the fog of dread clouding my thoughts. My feet pounded the pavement as I sprinted down the empty street, not even sure where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. But the whispering, it didn't stop. It followed me, clinging to the edges of my mind, growing louder with each passing second. It was as if it was coming from inside my head, reverberating through my skull like some twisted echo. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to drown it out, it was always there, gnawing at my sanity. "You can't escape." The words repeated over and over, a sinister chant that wrapped itself around my thoughts like a vice. I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't want to find out. I just kept running, hoping that somehow I could outrun whatever was coming for me. The streets were deserted, eerily silent, except for the distant hum of the city. I didn't even think about the direction I was heading. My only focus was to get as far away from my apartment as possible. But the farther I went, the more I realized something was wrong. The neighborhood around me didn't look familiar. I had lived in this town for years, but I suddenly couldn't recognize where I was. The houses were strange, older than anything I remembered, with peeling paint and cracked windows. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I slowed down, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to get my bearings. Had I taken a wrong turn? How was that possible? My apartment was in a part of town I knew like the back of my hand, but nothing here made sense. It was like I'd stepped into another world, one that looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. The whispering intensified, like it knew I was starting to realize the truth. I could feel it crawling inside my head, tugging at my thoughts, twisting them into something dark and incomprehensible. I tried to shake it off, to focus on finding my way back, but every street I turned onto led me deeper into this unfamiliar landscape. Panic gripped me as I realized I was lost, truly lost. The buildings around me seemed to close in, leaning over the street as if they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The road beneath my feet felt like it was shifting, warping under my weight, pulling me further away from anything that made sense. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but as soon as I saw the screen, my heart dropped. No signal. The bars were completely empty, the no service message glaring back at me like a death sentence. That made no sense. I was still in town, still surrounded by buildings and lights. There was no reason for my phone to suddenly stop working. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. Whatever was happening to me, it was deliberate. I tried to access the Maps app, hoping it could at least tell me where I was, but the screen just glitched out. Lines of static cut across the display, distorting the image until it was nothing but a jumbled mess of colors. Then the phone went black, the battery dead despite being at 70% just a few minutes earlier. I was on my own. No phone, no map, no clue where I was. The whispering grew louder, filling the empty night with its insidious presence. I could almost feel it pressing against my skull, pushing against the edges of my consciousness, trying to force its way in. And that's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the flickering streetlights. But as I squinted through the dim light, I realized there was someone standing at the end of the block, half hidden in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall and thin, unnaturally so, like their limbs had been stretched too far. They were standing perfectly still, facing me, though I couldn't make out any details. Just a vague, looming shape that seemed to blend into the shadows around it. A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run in the opposite direction, but I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the mere sight of this figure had paralyzed me with fear. The whispering in my head intensified, becoming almost unbearable. I could barely think, barely breathe, as it drilled into my mind, repeating that same phrase over and over. You can't escape. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the figure. It felt like time had stopped, like the world had narrowed down to just me and that thing at the end of the street. Then slowly, it started to move. The figure took a step forward, then another. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being yanked along by invisible strings. As it came closer, I could see more details. The way its limbs seemed to bend at odd angles, the way its head tilted unnaturally to the side, like it was trying to look at me from a distorted angle. And then, as it passed under a streetlight, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. There was no face, just a smooth, blank surface where features should have been, like someone had wiped it clean. But somehow, I knew it was staring at me, even without eyes. I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, drilling into me. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had held me in place. I turned and bolted, sprinting down the street as fast as my legs could carry me. The whispering roared in my ears, but I forced myself to push through it, to focus on putting as much distance between me and that thing as possible. I didn't dare look back. I could hear something behind me though, footsteps, quick and uneven, like it was struggling to keep up with my frantic pace. The sound filled me with a primal terror, the kind that comes from knowing you're being hunted. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I raced around corners, down alleys, trying to lose whatever was following me, but the footsteps never faded. They were always there, just behind me, relentless. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a small park. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting long shadows across the path. The park was deserted, eerily quiet, but I didn't care. I just needed a place to hide, to catch my breath, to figure out what the hell was happening to me. I dove into the thick bushes off the path, crouching down low, trying to make myself as small as possible. My chest heaved as I struggled to breathe quietly, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps had stopped, but I didn't dare move. I stayed there, hidden in the dark, listening, waiting. The whispering in my head had dulled to a low murmur, almost as if it was waiting too. I clung to the hope that I had finally lost whatever was chasing me, that I was safe, if only for a moment. But then, just as I started to relax, I heard it, a soft rustling, like someone moving through the bushes. It was close, too close. My breath hitched as I slowly turned my head, peering through the leaves. The figure was there, just a few feet away, its faceless head tilting back and forth, as if searching for something. I pressed myself further into the ground, willing myself to be invisible. It moved closer, its jerky steps crunching on the gravel path. My whole body tensed, my muscles screaming with the urge to run. But I knew if I made a sound, if I even breathed too loudly, it would find me. The figure paused, right in front of my hiding spot, so close I could see the fabric of its clothes, dark, tattered, like they had been dragged through mud and dirt. I watched in horror as its head tilted down, as if it could see right through the bushes, right into me. And then, just when I thought it was over, it turned and walked away. I didn't move. I didn't even let out the breath I was holding until it was long gone, its twisted form vanishing into the shadows. I waited, crouched in that bush, for what felt like hours. The night was still. The the whispering in my head fading into the background. When I finally felt it was safe, I crawled out, my body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to keep moving, had to find help, had to get away from whatever was hunting me. But as I stumbled back onto the path, a new realization struck me. I had no idea where I was. The park around me was unfamiliar, just like the streets had been. It was as if I'd been dropped into a different version of my town, one that existed in some twisted parallel world. Every landmark, every building was just wrong enough to make me feel like a stranger in my own life. I had no choice but to keep moving, hoping that if I walked far enough, I'd find something, someone that could help. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. The whispering might have faded, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And as I walked through the deserted streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That faceless figure might have left, but something else was out there, watching me, waiting. I kept walking, the fear gnawing at me, knowing that this was far from over. This wasn't just a nightmare I could wake up from. This was real, and it was only getting worse. Because no matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the truth. Something had found me that night, on the deep web. Something that knew my name, my fears, and it wasn't going to let me go. I walked for what felt like hours, each step taking me deeper into the unknown. The town around me had morphed into something almost unrecognizable, like a twisted reflection of the place I once knew. The houses were older, more decrepit, their windows dark and empty, like gaping mouths silently screaming for help. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, clawing at my sanity. I tried to focus on my surroundings, to find something, anything that might guide me back to familiar territory, but it was no use. The streets seemed to loop back on themselves, leading me in circles. Every turn brought me face to face with more of the same decaying buildings, the same deserted roads. The town had become a maze, and I was its trapped, frantic rat. The whispering had returned, though it was different now, softer, more insidious, like it was trying to lull me into some kind of sick submission. It whispered things I couldn't quite make out, fragments of sentences, disjointed words that melted together in a haunting symphony of dread. But there was one thing it said clearly, over and over, like a drumbeat in the back of my mind. You'll never be free. I tried to shut it out, to focus on anything else, but it was impossible. The words burrowed into my thoughts, infecting them, turning every corner of my mind into a breeding ground for fear. My heart raced, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as I struggled to hold on to whatever fragments of reality I had left. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was my apartment building. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the familiar structure, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way I could have ended up back here. I had been walking for what felt like hours, away from that place, away from everything that had started this nightmare. But there it was, standing tall and ominous, like some kind of twisted monument to my fear. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to keep running, but I was exhausted. I had no idea where else to go, no other options. The streets were a labyrinth, and every turn seemed to lead me back to this same spot, It was like the town itself was pushing me toward the building, forcing me to confront whatever awaited me inside. With no other choice, I slowly approached the entrance. The front door creaked open as I touched it, the sound echoing through the silent night, like a gunshot. The lobby was dark, the lights flickering weakly as if struggling to stay alive. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of foreboding that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a finality that made my heart sink. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every creak, every rustle of fabric, every shallow breath. The whispering grew louder, its words more distinct now, echoing off the walls like some kind of twisted prayer. I made my way to the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The door slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for my floor. The elevator lurched into motion, the grinding of its gears filling the confined space with a mechanical groan that set my teeth on edge. As the elevator ascended, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I pressed myself against the cold metal, trying to distance myself from the sound, but it was useless. It was everywhere, surrounding me, filling the tiny space with its ominous presence. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped out onto my floor, the hallway stretching out before me like a tunnel leading to the unknown. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, twisting and contorting into shapes that seemed almost alive. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, my senses on high alert for any sign of movement, any sound that might hint at what was waiting for me. My apartment door loomed at the end of the hallway, and with every step closer, the whispering grew more intense, until it was all I could hear, drowning out everything else. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me on the other side, but something compelled me to turn the knob, to push the door open. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting a pale glow through the blinds. Everything was exactly as I had left it. My furniture, my belongings, even the cup of coffee I'd abandoned on the counter. But the air felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle with unease. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and that's when I noticed it. The black envelope sitting on the coffee table, identical to the one I had found earlier. My stomach dropped as I approached it, my hands shaking as I reached out to pick it up. The envelope was cold to the touch, just like before, and my name was scrawled across the front in that same shaky handwriting. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was inside, but I couldn't stop myself. With trembling fingers, I tore it open, pulling out the piece of paper inside. The message was short, just 3 words, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. It's already inside. I dropped the note, my breath catching in my throat as I frantically looked around the room. My eyes darted to every shadow, every corner, but I saw nothing out of place. The apartment was empty, completely empty. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of fabric. It was coming from the bedroom. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest as I forced myself to walk toward the sound. The whispering had stopped completely now, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I could see a faint light spilling out from inside. I pushed the door open, my breath hitching as I stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything looked normal at first glance, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. In the corner of the room, standing perfectly still, was the figure. The same faceless figure that had been chasing me through the streets. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me with that blank, featureless face, its head tilted to the side in that same unnatural way. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, my body frozen in place, unable to move, unable to scream. And then, in a voice that wasn't my own, a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of my mind, I heard it speak. "You invited me in." The words echoed in my head, a haunting reminder of the choice I had made when I first typed yes into that chat. I had opened the door, and now, whatever this thing was, it was here, inside my home, inside my mind, inside me. The figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. I wanted to run, to get away, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was watch as it came closer and closer, until it was standing right in front of me, its blank face inches from mine. And then, without warning, everything went black. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It seeped into my bones, wrapping around me like an icy shroud. I was lying on the floor, my body stiff and unresponsive. My mind felt foggy, like I was waking up from a deep, dreamless sleep. The room was pitch black, darker than any night I'd ever experienced. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but even then, I could barely make out the shapes around me. Familiar contours of my bedroom were gone, replaced by an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything. I struggled to move, to get up, but my body felt like lead. Panic flared as I realized I was completely paralyzed, unable to even lift a finger. The cold continued to creep through me, gnawing at my insides, making it hard to think, to focus. That's when I heard it, the whispering. But this time, it wasn't inside my head. It was all around me, echoing off invisible walls, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a twisted chorus. The words were garbled, nonsensical, yet somehow I understood them. They were speaking to me, about me, revealing things I didn't want to know. "You shouldn't have come. You invited us. We're inside you now." The last line made my blood run cold. Inside me? What did that mean? I tried to shake the thoughts from my head, but they clung to me, like the whispering was embedding itself into my very being. I was no longer just hearing it. I was feeling it, deep within my core, a gnawing presence that was slowly, methodically, taking over. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy, oppressive weight that pressed down on me from all sides. I was alone in the darkness, but I could sense something, or someone, lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness. And then, a single cold voice pierced through the silence, clear and distinct. "You wanted to know the truth." The voice wasn't like the whispering. It was stronger, more deliberate, and it echoed in the void around me with an authority that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I knew it was addressing me directly. "The truth is, you've always been here. You've always been one of us." My heart raced, confusion and terror intertwining as I tried to comprehend the words. How could that be possible? I'd just stumbled onto that chat room out of curiosity. I didn't belong here. This wasn't me. But the voice continued, relentless. "You opened the door. You invited us in. Now, we are part of you, and you are part of us. Images flashed before my eyes, memories that weren't mine, places I'd never been, people I'd never met. It was like someone was playing a slideshow in my mind, showing me glimpses of a life I didn't recognize. But with each image, with each memory, I felt a connection, an unsettling familiarity that made my stomach churn. These weren't just random images. They were fragments of something larger, pieces of a puzzle that I was now a part of. I could feel the tendrils of something dark and ancient winding their way through my consciousness, binding me to a reality I hadn't even known existed. And then, with a sudden clarity that left me breathless, I understood. This wasn't just some chat room on the deep web. It wasn't just a random encounter with a faceless entity. It was something far older, far more powerful. I had unwittingly tapped into a network, a web that spanned beyond the physical world, connecting those who sought it out, those like me. This place, this entity, had been waiting for someone like me, someone curious, someone reckless, someone willing to open the door without understanding the consequences. And now that I had, there was no going back. You are one of us now, the voice whispered, softer this time, almost comforting. Embrace it, and you will see the truth. A wave of resignation washed over me. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept what was happening, but deep down, I knew it was true. I had made a choice, and now I was paying the price. The darkness around me shifted, and suddenly I was no longer in my apartment. I was standing in a vast, empty space, a void that stretched out infinitely in every direction. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, as if something monumental was about to happen. And then, in the distance, I saw them, the figures, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, standing in perfect silence, their faceless heads turned toward me. They were identical to the one that had chased me, but now there were so many of them, their presence overwhelming. They began to move, slowly at first, but then faster, closing in on me from all sides. I tried to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to do anything but watch as they surrounded me, their blank faces reflecting the void around us. As they closed in, I felt the darkness pressing in on me, seeping into my skin, my bones, my mind. The whispering returned, louder now, more insistent, filling my head with 1,000 voices, each one demanding something from me, each one claiming a piece of me. And then, as the darkness consumed me, I felt something shift inside. It was like a switch had been flipped, a connection made that I hadn't realized was there. The fear, the panic, the confusion, it all melted away, replaced by a cold, numb acceptance. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer running. I was part of this now, part of the darkness, part of the whispering. And as the last remnants of my old self faded away, I understood the final, terrible truth. There was no escape. There had never been any escape, because I had never really been free. Don't buy the Lilith board of the deep web. It comes with something horrifying. I'm not the type of person who easily believes in the supernatural or anything like that. In fact, I've always been the kind of guy who scoffs at horror movies and rolls my eyes at ghost stories. But I swear on everything I love, what I'm about to tell you really happened. It all started a few months ago when I found myself diving down one of those late night rabbit holes on the internet. You know how it goes. One video leads to another, and before you know it, you're in the weird part of YouTube, watching conspiracy theories, about government cover-ups or tutorials on how to hack old electronics. It was during one of these nights that I first stumbled onto a forum that was way darker than anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't just a regular creepy forum, it was deep web territory. I had heard of the deep web before, mostly horror stories about people buying illegal stuff or finding things they weren't supposed to. But I was curious, maybe too curious for my own good. I clicked on the link and found myself in a thread about something called the Lilith board. The description was vague, but it piqued my interest. It was supposedly an ancient type of spirit board, older and more powerful than your typical Ouija board. The seller claimed it was handcrafted in the 1800s by a cult that worshipped Lilith, the first wife of Adam, who was cast out of Eden. According to the post, the board was different because it didn't just allow you to communicate with spirits. It was said to summon something darker, something that wasn't supposed to be contacted. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like the setup to a bad horror movie, right? Believe me, I thought the same thing. But there was something about that post, something almost hypnotic. The way it was written felt like it was calling out to me. And the kicker, the board was up for auction. The starting bid was ridiculously low, probably because nobody else was dumb enough to buy it. I laughed at myself as I placed the bid. It was just a piece of wood, right? I told myself it would be a cool, creepy thing to show off to friends. I didn't expect to win, but a few days later, I got an email. The board was mine. When the package arrived, it looked pretty unremarkable. Just a plain brown box with no markings. I took it inside and cut it open with a kitchen knife. Inside, wrapped in what looked like old newspaper, was the Lilith board. It was smaller than I expected, made of dark, almost black wood, with strange symbols carved around the edges. The letters and numbers were painted in a deep crimson, and the planchette was a simple piece of wood, smooth and worn from what seemed like years of use. Despite how old it looked, the board had a strange, almost oily sheen to it, like it had been polished regularly. There was a weird smell too, something earthy and a little metallic, like old blood, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination. For the first couple of days, I didn't do much with the board. I showed it to a few friends who thought it was weird but cool. Most of them told me I was stupid for buying something like that off the deep web. I laughed it off, saying it was just a silly impulse buy. But then, things started to get strange. It was subtle at first, just small, barely noticeable things. I'd leave the board on the shelf in my living room, but when I'd come back later, it would be in a different position. Sometimes the planchette would be moved slightly, like someone had been playing with it while I was out. I lived alone, so there was no one else who could have touched it. At first, I thought maybe I was just imagining things, or that maybe I'd nudged it without realizing, but the weirdness didn't stop there. I started having these vivid dreams, almost like nightmares, but more real. In these dreams, I was sitting in front of the Lilith board, watching as the planchette moved on its own, spelling out words I couldn't understand. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and the first thing I'd do was check the board. Every time it would be in a different spot, the planchette always pointing to a letter or number. Once, it spelled out RETURN. I tried to laugh it off, but it was getting harder to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. I was starting to think maybe the stories about the board weren't just stories. Maybe there was something more to it, something dangerous. Then one night, everything changed. That night, I had another one of those dreams, but this time, it was different. I wasn't just watching the planchette move on its own. I was holding it, my fingers resting lightly on the wood, almost like I was being guided by something else. The room around me was dark, except for the soft glow of a candle in the corner, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. In the dream, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was watching me from just beyond the edge of the darkness. The planchette moved slowly, dragging my fingers along with it, spelling out the word AWAKEN. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. It felt like my hand was glued to the board, like some invisible force was keeping me there. When I finally woke up, it was still dark, and my room was cold, much colder than it should have been for a summer night. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your teeth chatter. I reached over to my bedside table to turn on the lamp, but the bulb flickered and then died, plunging the room into darkness again. I fumbled for my phone, using the dim light from the screen to see. My hands were trembling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. As I scanned the room with the weak light from my phone, something caught my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. It was just a faint outline, barely visible against the wall, but it was there. It looked like the shape of a person, tall and thin, but twisted, like its limbs were just a little too long, its posture hunched and unnatural. I stared at it, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But as I watched, the shadow seemed to move, just slightly, as if it was leaning closer. I shot out of bed, my heart racing, and flicked the light switch on the wall. The bulb above me buzzed and then flared to life, casting a harsh light across the room. The shadow was gone. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I could feel my skin prickling with fear, every instinct telling me to get out of there. But instead, I did something stupid. I went to the living room. The Lilith board was still there, sitting on the coffee table where I had left it, the planchette resting dead center on the board. But the room was different. It felt wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch farther, the corners of the room darker than they should have been. And there was that smell again, that metallic, earthy smell, but stronger this time, almost like something was decaying. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the board. There was this pull, like it was calling to me, beckoning me closer. I knew I should have left, should have just gotten rid of the damn thing, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the board like it was the only thing that mattered. And then, without thinking, I sat down in front of it. The room was deathly silent. The only sound was the faint ringing in my ears. My hands moved on their own, placing the tips of my fingers on the planchette. The wood was cold, almost icy to the touch, sending a shiver up my spine. The planchette started moving, slowly at first, but then picking up speed, sliding across the board with a smooth, deliberate motion. I wasn't moving it. At least I didn't think I was. It felt like something else was guiding my hands, something that wasn't me. It spelled out ISHALLCOME. My throat was dry, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to stop, to take my hands off the planchette, but I couldn't. It was like I was trapped, my body no longer my own. Then I heard it, the faintest whisper, like someone was speaking right next to my ear. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, but twisted, like it was struggling to speak through a mouth full of broken glass. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a threat. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath in front of me. The candle in the corner of my mind's eye flared up, casting monstrous shadows on the walls, twisting and writhing like they were alive. The planchette stopped moving abruptly, landing on the word yes. And then, everything went still. I yanked my hands away from the board and stumbled back, knocking over the coffee table in the process. The board clattered to the floor, the planchette skidding across the hardwood and coming to a stop at the foot of the couch. My head was spinning, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I backed away from the board, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to burn it, to get rid of it any way I could, but another part of me, the part that had been drawn to it in the first place, felt like that was the worst thing I could do. Like if I tried to destroy it, something terrible would happen. That was when I noticed the smell again, stronger than ever. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned around. The shadow was back, but this time it wasn't just a shadow. It was solid, standing in the doorway, its head tilted to one side like it was studying me. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs long and crooked. It was almost human, but not quite. Something was off about it, something deeply, horribly wrong. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I could feel its eyes on me, even though its face was just a featureless black void. My legs finally obeyed me, and I bolted for the door. I didn't look back as I ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I just kept running, out of my apartment, down the stairs, and into the street, not stopping until I was a good block away. I didn't go back that night. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night at a 24-hour diner, trying to convince myself that it was all just some kind of waking nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever I had brought into my home, it wasn't just a board. It was something else, something ancient and angry, and it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, its twisted, unnatural shape lurking in the shadows of my apartment. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted, but the fear kept me wide awake. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just leave that board sitting in my living room, waiting for whatever was attached to it to come back. But what could I do? Burning it felt wrong, like it might make things worse. Throwing it away seemed pointless, like it would somehow find its way back to me. By the time I finally decided to go back to my apartment, the sun was already high in the sky. The daylight gave me a false sense of security, like everything would be fine as long as it was bright out. But even then, I could feel the anxiety gnawing at the back of my mind. When I got back to my building, I hesitated at the entrance. The memory of that shadowy figure standing in the doorway flashed through my mind, and I almost turned around. But I had to deal with this. I couldn't live like this, constantly afraid of my own home. The hallway leading to my apartment felt longer than usual, the walls closing in on me as I approached my door. I took a deep breath and unlocked it, pushing the door open slowly, half expecting that thing to be standing there, waiting for me. But the apartment was empty. The morning light streamed in through the windows, casting soft, harmless shadows across the floor. Everything looked normal. Almost. The Lilith board was still lying on the floor where I had left it, the planchette resting by the couch. The air in the room was stale, and that smell, the metallic, earthy odor, still lingered, faint but unmistakable. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the board. I didn't want to touch it, didn't even want to get near it, but I knew I had to. I couldn't just leave it there, not knowing what might happen next. I grabbed a pair of kitchen gloves, hoping that would somehow protect me from whatever curse or evil might be attached to it, and carefully picked up the board. The wood felt cold and heavy in my hands, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow aware of me, like it was waiting for me to do something. I set it down on the kitchen table and sat across from it, my mind racing. I had no idea what I was doing, but I had to try something. Maybe if I could figure out what it wanted, I could get rid of it, or at least make it stop haunting me. That's when I remembered the deep web forum where I had found the board in the first place. Maybe there was something I missed, something that could tell me more about what I was dealing with. I grabbed my laptop and started searching, hoping to find the thread again. It took a while, but eventually I found it. The post was still there, the same cryptic description, the same warnings that I had foolishly ignored. But this time, I noticed something new, a link buried deep in the comments, leading to another site. This site was different. The background was pitch black, and the text was in a strange, archaic font. It looked like it hadn't been updated in years. The homepage was a single paragraph, written in broken English, warning visitors that the information contained within was dangerous, that it was not meant for the living. There was a list of articles, each one more disturbing than the last. Rituals, summoning guides, ancient texts, all of them claiming to give power over the unknown, but with dire consequences. I scrolled through until I found one titled Lilith Board, a conduit to the other world. The article was long and rambling, filled with references to ancient texts and forbidden rituals, but the gist of it was clear. The Lilith Board wasn't just a tool for communication. It was a doorway, a way to invite something into our world, something that wasn't meant to be here. The article described how the board was used by a cult that worshipped Lilith, and how they believed the board could summon her or her servants into our world. But it wasn't just a summoning tool. It was also a trap. Once the board was activated, once you made contact, it became bound to you. Destroying it wouldn't stop whatever was attached to it. It would just release it fully into our world, with no way to send it back. The only way to get rid of it was to pass it on to someone else. But even then, the transfer had to be done carefully. The new owner had to accept the board willingly, and they had to use it. Only then would the curse shift to them. I felt sick reading that, realizing what I'd gotten myself into. I couldn't just get rid of the board. I'd have to trick someone else into taking it, someone as clueless as I had been. The thought of doing that to another person made my skin crawl. But what choice did I have? As I was reading, I heard it again, that soft, whispering voice, the one I had heard in my dream. It was faint, like it was coming from far away, but it was there. It was coming from the board. I looked over at the table, and my blood ran cold. The planchette was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was sliding across the board, spelling out something. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what it was saying, but my eyes were drawn to it. IAMNEAR. The room suddenly felt colder, and that smell, metallic and earthy, grew stronger. I could feel the presence again, that thing that had been in my apartment before. It was close, too close. In a panic, I grabbed the board, shoving it back into the box it came in. I had to get it out of my apartment, had to get it away from me before it was too late. I ran out the door, not caring who saw me, clutching the box like it was a ticking time bomb. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going, just trying to get as far away from that thing as possible. Eventually, I ended up in a small rundown town in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions, where you could disappear if you wanted to. I found a dingy little motel on the outskirts of town and checked in. The room was small and smelled of mildew, but I didn't care. I just needed a place to think, to figure out what to do next. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I could feel it, whatever was attached to the board, lurking just outside my room, waiting for me to let my guard down. The shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own, stretching and shifting like they were alive. And that voice, that horrible, whispering voice, kept echoing in my head, growing louder and more insistent. IAMCOMING. I knew then that running wasn't enough. I couldn't escape it, not as long as I had the board. It was only a matter of time before it found me, before it broke through whatever fragile barrier was keeping it at bay. I had to do something. I had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of knocking on the motel door. My heart nearly stopped as I bolted upright, every muscle tensed. The knocking was soft, almost polite, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. I crept toward the door, my footsteps barely making a sound on the worn carpet. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly peeked through the peephole. Relief washed over me when I saw an elderly woman standing outside, holding a tray with a steaming cup of coffee. She must have been the motel owner. I opened the door cautiously, my mind still racing from the events of the previous night. "Morning, dear," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought you might like some coffee. On the house." "Thanks," I muttered, taking the cup from her, though I wasn't sure I could stomach anything. She lingered for a moment, her eyes flicking over me, and then her gaze shifted to the room behind me. I noticed a brief, almost imperceptible frown, like she had seen something that disturbed her. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," she said, her voice suddenly quiet, almost wary. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, the coffee cup cooling in my hands. I shut the door and set the cup down on the nightstand, my mind churning. Something about the way she looked at the room made me uneasy. Did she sense something, or was it just my paranoia getting the better of me? I pushed the thought aside. I had bigger things to worry about. The box with the Lilith board was still sitting in the corner of the room, as if it were watching me. I had spent most of the night scouring the deep website I had found, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. Buried deep in the site, I found something, a ritual. It wasn't a way to destroy the board, but it claimed to bind whatever was attached to it, to seal it away so it couldn't harm anyone. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. The ritual was complex, and the instructions were vague, almost as if they were written to be deliberately confusing. It required specific items, most of which were things I had never heard of, let alone seen. But one thing stood out to me: the blood of the one who summoned it. That meant me. I spent the rest of the day gathering the items I could find. Some were easy: a black candle, salt, a mirror. Others required a bit more creativity. I ended up at a local antique shop, hoping to find something that would work as a makeshift talisman. The shop was dusty and cluttered, filled with old trinkets and forgotten relics. The owner was a quiet, middle-aged man who seemed disinterested in me, which suited me just fine. As I was browsing, I felt a sudden chill, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing behind me. But the shop was empty, save for the owner, who was busy at the counter. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. A small silver locket, tucked away on a shelf in the back. It was old, the surface tarnished and scratched, but there was something about it that drew me in. Without thinking, I grabbed it and took it to the counter. "That'll do," I said, sliding the money across the counter. The owner glanced at the locket, then at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Be careful with that," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's older than it looks. Has a history." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and left the shop. Back at the motel, I prepared everything for the ritual. I cleared the floor in the center of the room, laying out the items as carefully as I could. The instructions from the site were difficult to follow, full of strange symbols and phrases in a language I didn't recognize. But I did my best, drawing the symbols on the floor with chalk, arranging the items in a circle around the Lilith board. Finally, I lit the black candle and placed it in the center of the board, right on top of the planchette. The flame flickered wildly, as if it were struggling against some unseen force. My hands were shaking as I picked up the knife. The ritual required my blood, a binding agent to seal whatever was attached to the board. I hesitated, the blade hovering over my palm, but I knew there was no turning back now. I had to do this. With a deep breath, I sliced my palm, wincing as the blood welled up. I let it drip onto the board, watching as the dark wood absorbed it. The moment my blood touched the board, the candle flame flared up, turning from orange to a deep, unnatural blue. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening, twisting around the edges of the circle I had drawn. I began chanting the words from the site, stumbling over the unfamiliar phrases, my voice barely a whisper. As I spoke, the air around me seemed to thicken, growing heavy and oppressive. I could feel it, the presence, the thing that had been haunting me, pressing in closer, its malevolent energy almost palpable. The shadows on the walls began to move, writhing like they were alive. I kept chanting, my voice growing louder, more desperate, as the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in ragged gasps, visible in the freezing air. Suddenly, the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. The shadows seemed to converge on me, closing in, and I felt a cold, bony hand grip my shoulder. I screamed, the sound echoing in the small room, but I didn't stop chanting. I couldn't. If I stopped, I knew it would be the end. The pressure on my shoulder intensified, and I could feel something cold and sharp pressing against my skin, like claws or icy fingers. The whisper started again, louder this time, the same twisted voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room fell silent. The air was still heavy, but the oppressive feeling had lifted. I dared to open my eyes and saw that the candle had relit itself, the flame a steady, soft blue. The shadows were gone, the air warming slightly as the temperature returned to normal. I looked down at the Lilith board. The blood had soaked into the wood, the symbols on the board glowing faintly in the candlelight. The planchette was still, resting in the center of the board. For a moment, I just sat there, too stunned to move. Had it worked? Had I really sealed it away? I couldn't be sure, but the room felt different, less hostile. The overwhelming sense of dread that had been hanging over me was gone. I knew I couldn't keep the board, not after everything that had happened. I had to get rid of it, but not by passing it on to someone else. I wasn't going to curse another person with this nightmare. Instead, I carefully wrapped it in the cloth I had brought, placed it back in the box, and sealed it with duct tape. The next morning, I drove out to the edge of town, to a dense forest I had passed on my way in. I parked the car and hiked deep into the woods, as far away from any trail as I could manage. When I was sure I was alone, I dug a hole deep enough to bury the box. I didn't say anything as I placed the box in the hole and covered it with dirt. I didn't perform any final rites, didn't say a prayer. I just wanted to be done with it. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, hidden among the trees, but I didn't look back. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I was back in my car. When I got back to the motel, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove, putting as much distance between me and that place as I could. But even now, I'm not sure if I'm truly free. The dreams have stopped. The shadows no longer move on their own, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That whatever I summoned isn't bound to the board, but to me. And somewhere, out there in the woods, the Lilith board is still waiting, buried deep, but not forgotten. I can only hope it stays there. It's been weeks since I buried the Lilith board, and life has been quieter, but not normal. Not really. I've moved to a new city, far from where everything happened. I found a cheap apartment in a crowded area, hoping that being surrounded by people might make me feel safer. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape the lingering sense that something is still with me, like a shadow I can't shake. I tried to go back to my routine, pretending everything was fine, but the nights are the hardest. Every time I close my eyes, I feel it, that creeping cold sensation, like fingers brushing against my skin. The dreams haven't come back, but sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced that something is standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I haven't told anyone what happened. How could I? Who would believe me? They'd think I'm crazy, and maybe they'd be right. But I've stayed off the deep web, deleted every trace of those forums, blocked every thought of the board from my mind. At least I've tried to. But something happened last night that I can't ignore. Something that makes me think I might not be done with this nightmare after all. It started with a knock at my door. It was late, probably around midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I had been lying in bed, tossing and turning, trying to find some peace in the dark. The knock was soft, hesitant, almost as if the person on the other side wasn't sure if they should be there. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and approached the door. I hesitated, the memories of the last time I answered a knock late at night flooding back. Then I heard a voice, familiar, yet impossible. "Please, help me." It was faint, but unmistakable. It was the voice of the old woman from the motel, the one who had brought me coffee that morning, the one who had looked into my room with those wary eyes, like she had known something was wrong. My blood ran cold. There was no way it could be her. She was miles away, in a town I had left behind. I stood frozen, staring at the door, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking continued, a little louder this time, more urgent. Please, I need your help. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. Slowly, I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. I had to know. I had to see. I opened the door a crack and peered out into the hallway. It was empty, just the long, dimly lit corridor of my apartment building stretching out into the darkness. But the voice continued, clearer now, as if it were right next to me. Please, it's coming. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing, and backed away, almost tripping over my own feet. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The voice was coming from inside my head now, echoing through my mind, filling me with a deep, primal fear. Then the temperature in the room dropped. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could see my breath in front of me, the room plunging into an unnatural cold. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. I was paralyzed with fear, my back pressed against the wall, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't move. I could hear it now, the faint whispering, that same twisted voice I had heard during the ritual, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. It was speaking words I couldn't understand, a language that felt ancient and malevolent. And then I saw it, the shadow. It was back, darker and more defined than ever, standing in the corner of the room. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had substance, a form, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. It started to move, slow and deliberate, its black, featureless face turning toward me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing closer, the air thickening with a suffocating weight. The shadow stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. It reached out with one long, bony arm, the fingers stretching out toward me. I could feel the cold radiating from it, seeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out, and then, just as it was about to touch me, it stopped. The room was silent, the air still, but the shadow remained, hovering just inches away. I could feel its presence, dark and oppressive, filling the space around me. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something else, something ancient and hungry. The whispering grew louder, filling my mind, driving me to the brink of madness. And then, in a sudden terrifying moment of clarity, I understood what it was saying. You are mine. The words echoed in my head over and over as the shadow slowly withdrew, fading back into the corner of the room. The air grew warmer, the lights flickering back on, the oppressive weight lifting, but the shadow didn't disappear. It stayed there, lurking in the corner, a dark stain on the fabric of reality, watching me. I knew then that it wasn't over. The ritual hadn't worked. I hadn't sealed it away. I had only awakened it, given it strength, and now it was bound to me, feeding off my fear, growing stronger every day. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The shadow is always there, watching, waiting. I can feel it creeping closer every night, the cold seeping into my dreams, turning them into nightmares. I've tried everything, prayers, rituals, exorcisms, but nothing works. The shadow is with me, and it's never going to leave. It's part of me now, a dark, malignant presence that I can't escape. I don't know what will happen when it finally reaches me, when the last barrier between us breaks down, but I'm terrified of finding out. I'm writing this down as a warning. If you ever come across the Lilith board, don't be tempted. Don't think you can control it, that you can outsmart it. It's not just a game, it's a doorway, a conduit to something far older and more dangerous than you can imagine. And once it's opened, there's no going back. I don't know how much longer I have. The shadow is growing stronger. Its whispers louder, more insistent. I can feel it closing in, and I don't think I can fight it much longer. If you're reading this, don't try to help me. It's too late for that. Just stay away, and whatever you do, don't look into the darkness. Don't listen to the whispers, because once you do, you'll never be free.